next presentation is Intricacies of Acquiring Data Services. That sounds really interesting to me personally, so I can't wait. And I'll let Richard go ahead and share his interesting background and role. So thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
There you go. Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. This is such a fascinating conference, and there are so many different tracks. I don't know how well my topic fit into any one or multiple of them, but I definitely think you're going to learn something, hopefully that you're going to get some engaged with something today that you may or may not have thought a lot about in the work that you do today. But so my background, I'm a government employee. So the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, is a government chartered corporation. We're an insurance company that insures bank deposits for consumers, and so we work with America's banks to make sure that their deposits are safe. We examine banks that we are the regulator for, and we also work with other regulators, including the Federal Reserve and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, to regulate and examine banks for safety and soundness. So, but in my role, I'm the Assistant Director today of Enterprise Information and Records Management. So I'm very much in the information side. However, data has become something that I have quite a bit to do with because I bring in all the commercial data resources that the corporation consumes. So work with a number of providers, and a really variety of from very small amounts to very large amounts of data that are consumed by our systems and organizations, by our scientists to do the research that they do. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of overview of what we're going to cover today, and we'll walk through this because it's kind of a, tips and tricks, lessons learned, things you might want to think about as you're acquiring data from commercial services. So, and there are a lot of different data providers in every different discipline and focus. So depending on whatever you're doing, you may have a service provider that has data that you want to consume and utilize. So we're going to start highly at what are we talking about here. We're going to dig down into how we do it and how other people do it, looking specifically at market research, because when you're going out there to acquire data, you need to know who the providers are, understand the intricacies of it, and do the real market research to determine, are you getting what your organization needs, and are you getting what's the best in show out there today. We're going to look at establishing that relationship with the provider, talking about transfer and transform versus connect and query. We'll get into some details about that. And then also integrating with internal resources. Once you have a commercial data resource, how do you bring it together with things you have in-house? Talking about developing use cases and understanding what people are doing with the data. And finally, I think this is true of everything we do, assessing whether or not what we're doing is adding value, delivering value, and if you need to change your process. So it creates a loop. You start back again at the top once you've done an assessment. But let's start broadly at what are commercial data services. So commercial data can be everything from public data that's put out there for anyone to consume, all the way down to extremely expensive, extremely hard to get, and very specialized data that your organization may need from a commercial service, and either to provide context to your internal knowledge or just to drive decision making. Whatever type of work that you do, you may have commercial services that can derive it and support that. And I emphasize that it can actually be public too, because there is a lot of great data that's publicly available. Things like postal codes you can get from the U.S. Post Office. So you can decide to consume that postal code data set. They have an API, they have data you can download, but there are also a lot of commercial providers that have taken that U.S. postal code data and they've added value to it. They've cleaned it up. They've added information that they could develop. And it may make it easier and quicker for you to utilize in your systems to go with a commercial provider that has added value to a public data set. So it's important for you to know where did this come from and what has been done to it, and is this the service I want to trust? But you can always consume the raw data and do your own transformations and work with it, or you can find someone who's done some work that you would otherwise have spent time and money to do as well. So there's nothing wrong with buying a public data set because, again, it's going to be trustworthy, it's going to work the way you want it to, it's going to fit into your systems, and that may save you a lot more time and money than it's worth to try and take something for free. So the other thing is that there are other providers that will provide you with free data, but you probably have to agree to something like their terms and conditions or some restrictions, et cetera. There are lots of Google Trends data, by example, that they are happy to let you consume and utilize, but you do have to go through that agreement and you have your attorneys look at it to determine, is what we're going to do with this data within the context of what this agreement is. You're not having to pay anybody anything, but you are having to go through a process to agree to the terms and conditions. So some basic examples, additional basic examples, geospatial layers. There are lots of different services out there that'll give you free information about the geography of where you're working. Not just zip codes, but the terrain and the borders and things like that. So if you're working internally in a system and you don't have that already available, you can pull in those public services. Ontologies and controlled vocabularies. There are quite a few organizations that will give you access to their controlled vocabularies so that you can begin to build your own system. Now, the nice thing is you can then tree off of that, develop your own keywords and capabilities, and you can even share that back as well if you want to say, here are some additional words and terms that you might want to use as well. Some advanced examples, things that I've been involved with at times, and that I include business profiles, information about businesses. You can license a lot of information. Some of it's publicly available from either the registering agents in states and government agencies. Market data, and when I say market data, it's everything from securities prices, credit default swaps, all the different things that are happening. And there are a number of commercial providers for market data, some of which you may know and trust today, some of which are creating very specialized capabilities. Climate risk, actuarial models. There are some of those that are free, and plenty of those that are then enhanced beyond the free version. The climate risk scenarios, similarly, there are some free things out there and some things you can pay a premium for that are already developed according to certain standards for you to utilize. And finally, real-time data for commercial use. This can be anywhere from, temperature data or emissions data from the EPA. If you wanted to get a real-time emissions report for a location, that kind of data is consumable, it's available. If you have a business need for it, if it's something that really will enhance your systems, there's a lot of real-time data you can also consume. So how to select what to acquire? We've already laid out it's a pretty broad universe, and there are lots of people out there that will sell you something, well, whether or not you can trust it, whether or not you know where it comes from, some of the things that you have to kind of start to ask good questions about. And the other thing is you have to decide what the value is of those inputs to your analysis and decision making. If something costs $1 million, but it's going to save your corporation $10 million, then it's worth doing. If it costs $1 million and you find out a year later that no one actually ever loaded it and used it, you need to reevaluate either the decision-making process, the requesting process, or the technology process to bring it in-house and actually put it to use. So. We've talked a little bit about open data, public data sets, open sources, but also academic data sets. There are plenty of academic people producing data sets in areas that you might be interested in that you could then begin to bring in and utilize either as a start to your own work or something that you can then leverage against. If you're running generative models or quantitative models, you can potentially utilize data and information that academics and other organizations have used so that you have something to validate your own work against. So. There are a lot of providers that will sell you data and data services based on your topic of your work, and I think it's important for you to understand the marketplace. It's sometimes not hard to go out there and just say who are the competitors for this, but other times, especially if you're getting down into the weeds, it's sometimes hard to determine who all has a very specific piece of data, and also where they got that data and what they've done to either add value or enhance that data. Even if you can't afford it, it's a good idea to have it on your list of this is someone else who does this, so that the next time you go out, you might be surprised at what they can do for you or why they want to have your business. So you need to understand the use case, their business model, and the value proposition. It's amazing to me how many times I ask a vendor or a salesperson, how do you sell this? I don't want to know the price. I want to know what factors go into the price. Is it the number of times I pull it in? Is it the number of values that I am pulling in from you? Or is it a subscription that says you can have as much as you want for this period of time? And so those kinds of conversations, again, most of the time they come in with a number in their head, and it's a number based on who we are, what we do, and what they think their data is worth to our business. But I need to understand how they sell this across the board, across the industry, so that I don't want it to be a special price for us, either up or down. I want to understand how they price their products so that we know what we're getting, and also what we could go out to the market to potentially get a better deal from someone else as well. So some data services are one-time, some are on-demand. Others are long-term relationships that you foster and manage for years. Assuming that you're going to need this data for an ongoing decision process, it is an ongoing process, a relationship. So, but it also can be a relationship that is, we only need one of these, right now we only need a little bit, but if we have a crisis, we need a lot of it. And, it's a good idea, and we work very hard to price things not only for what we're doing now, but what we could potentially do if there is a financial crisis, a surge in activity, et cetera, so that we know how to ramp up and how to move from a very small amount of data to a much larger amount, depending upon the situation. So we've been talking a little bit about market research, and I can honestly say that some of this is hard to do. I mean, you can absolutely go to industry conferences. You can also look online as to who the competitors between two business units are. But the reality is sometimes you have to talk to other people in your market space, say, how are you getting this information? Or who's providing this? Or what have you found out there that does this or that? And sometimes it's going back to the business and saying, do you know of anybody that produces this kind of data? It's horrible when I get I need this data. I'm like, I have no idea where that would come from. And we go back and forth, and sometimes it's a public data set, but its latency is every 2 weeks or every month or 6 months old, and we need to find who has the real time, who has the current information. We work across the lines to figure that out. We also have mentioned a few times already the value-added work, and is that something that is required or necessary, or is it something that truly is delivering something that we need to go beyond just having a raw source to be able to use? So I talk about due diligence. I hate to use that term because it's not a legal concept, although your attorneys should be involved at every stage in understanding what you are. Because you don't really buy data, you license data. You get approval to bring their data into your environment and to use it in ways that they understand you're going to use it. And sometimes I have done this a lot where I've had to go back to a provider and says, we actually need to take this extract of your data and provide it to this co-author on a paper, or to this regulatory provider who is going to share a regulatory oversight with us. Sometimes they'll say that is perfectly fine, here is the addendum to our agreement, and here's the cost. And other times they say, that's perfectly fine, we understand why you're doing this and what you're going to get out of it. As long as you cite our data in this way, we won't charge you more, and we will let this external party use it. So I have been told no a couple of times. You don't get no until you ask, and I'd rather get a no when I ask instead of a cease and desist when something comes out and they realize that their data has been integrated or utilized in a way that they weren't aware of. So. That's why it's a relationship. It's not a transactional relationship even. It's more of a very much an understanding of this is what, and the thing that I have the opportunity to do is I'm not their typical customer for any of these data sources. They're selling to traders. They're selling to market managers, to people that are managing portfolios. And we're a regulator, but we're also an insurance company. So we have this interesting definition of who we are and how their data helps us make decisions, that we can have a better conversation, and typically we can find a path forward to how to bring their data into our organization for the purposes that we need it to. So there are at times, and you should identify them, aggregators, resellers, and licensed agents that can bring data sets together for you prior to your purchase, or can represent a provider in a much more streamlined way at times. So you don't always have to go to the source. You can go to a reseller or an agent for that data provider. And sometimes those agents have easier to connect to services, better pricing for as you need it kinds of activities instead of buying the whole thing if you don't need the whole thing. So. I can't emphasize this enough, and I'm not suggesting that it's you and you alone. Read the terms and conditions carefully. And that's not just you. You may not understand them. So read it with a highlighter and highlight the things you don't understand. And that's what you pass on to your attorney, to say, this is what they're asking us to agree to. These are the things I don't understand. You can even pass them back to the business to say, this is what it would mean if we got this data. This is what we can and cannot do with it. There are some licenses that will limit what you can combine their data with. So don't think once you've bought or licensed this data, you bring it in-house and you can do whatever you want to with it. There are sometimes restrictions, especially when you're bringing data in around the same topic area from two different competitive providers. They don't want you to be able to compare or aggregate these data sources to see, now I think you should be from a data quality perspective able to compare, but not from an analytical and decision-making process. So most agreements prevent you from producing and distributing derivative works with their data is integrated. They're either restricting it or they're defining how and when you can do it, and definitely how their work is cited or identified in it as well. So, it is a benefit to them when we produce a report that cites data that is coming from a specific provider, because that drives banks and other analysts to go out and get access to those data sets in order to do similar analyses, to utilize that data differently. So. Most agreements today seek indemnification from any third-party data included in the product you are purchasing. Now, indemnification is a problem for the government. We are not allowed to indemnify, a provider, but we can work with them to explain how our use of their product and how our expectations are set. Typically, if we have a problem with the data, we will go and buy it from a better provider, or we'll buy different data. We're not going to go to them and say we lost money because we used your data and therefore you're liable. But these indemnification clauses are things that attorneys have to work through. So we're not attorneys for the most part, I don't think, in this room, and so I value their work, and I'm glad we have good ones. I always have to train them up to understand what we're doing here, and it's a process. I hate to lose one because once you get them understanding this process, it goes quicker in the future. So defining your use case will help the vendor price and license their content. It's amazing to me when as I mentioned, we're not traders, we're not market portfolio managers. When I sit down with their attorney and explain this is how we're bringing it in and this is what we're going to do with it, oftentimes the terms will change or the restrictions will be dropped because they realize we're never going to use it to make money or to produce something. So we can actually get further by talking about how we're going to use their information. Now, there are times when they say, great, let's put that in writing so you can't use it in other ways. And again, if I'm not planning to, it's perfectly easy to do. And there are plenty of times when I can say it's going to be used by this small group, but if we decide to expand that, we will also pay more, and we can license the number of users or the number of units that are involved. So, the amount you're paying for this really drives is it worth it, more so than whether or not we should even be pursuing it, because you obviously have a use case for the data you're trying to bring in, but the cost of it is something you've got to decide, is it worth it? So when you bring commercial data in, you have to think about what format it's in, how it's coming to you, and what you want to do with it to determine if you want to bring it in as a huge data set and then normalize it along with data you already have, or if you want to bring it in as an API source or something you can query and bring in only when you need to. Sometimes as a reference point, you can simply say, if we're looking for, say, a business and we've got an address, we can go out and query for that address and bring back that business information instead of storing 8 million businesses that you're only going to query a very small component to. You can also decide maybe to bring in only a certain NAICS codes if you know your industry, and then you can go out and query for those things that fall outside of that, because sometimes NAICS codes don't really cover your industry fully. So, but you would decide if you're going to bring in transform, and transfer and transform your data, that data into your environment, which for a data lake might be worth doing if it's going to be connected to several sources, if you want to have one of those columns or rows to be directly linked to your other stuff. But if you really just want to be able to go out and find out whether this data source has the information, you can set it up as an API query and only bring in the elements that you need to make your decision. So These decisions are going to help you decide how much infrastructure, how much preparation, and how much process you have to put around being able to use this data in your environment. So, and as I've mentioned already, you can do both strategies. You can have some of the data on site, and you can bring some of it in as a query. We've looked at this when trying to describe assets that we're interested in. We may have a basic data set that says what is the asset, but then we may only pull in the price data on an as-needed basis. We can go out and query for that as we need to. Set it up before thinking about how we're going to integrate these data sources with internal resources. The reality is all of this data is a little bit messy. Even the commercial data is not always consistent. And this is something that I've thought about just in the last couple of days, hearing from this conference is, looking for the number of null sets in a data dictionary in a data set to say how many of these business entities do not have an NAICS code associated to them. That probably is going to mean work for you if you're going to use that as a key feature to go out and fill in that gap. How many of these addresses don't actually resolve to a business entity. That's something you may want to test out and trial before you decide how much money and time to put into this. Whether you call it a data warehouse, a data lake, or a data mesh, where the data is stored and how it's formatted needs to be something your internal users can understand and navigate. So getting that data dictionary for that commercial data set, and analyzing that against the way you capture data in your own systems and knowing where those links are and where those connectors are will help people be able to utilize this data source to make a more informed decision. Sometimes we're very limited in our internal views as to what we know about the topic that we're looking at. And when we bring an external data source in, it can truly open up our eyes as to, like ownership of a company. Is it a subsidiary of a company? How far up the chain can we go to say, are we looking at an entity that has a lot deeper pockets than we thought? Because we could sue them for higher damages because of who owns them and, things like that. So not that we do that at the FDIC. I've done that in other agencies. So, but sometimes you can go out individually to these data sources and get that information, but a lot of times bringing it in helps you kind of create those dots. And when you think about how AI can help you, it can begin to explore those and expose those for you. At this point, you'll need a good understanding of the data your organization creates, how those internal resources can be combined with external resources to create new insights. To be honest, your internal resources are probably just as dirty, if not confusing, in their data dictionary and in what they're capturing, how they've captured it, how trustworthy the data is and how much cleanup needs to be done. When you bring in a commercial source, the nice thing is you have something to say. You could accept this. If this address resolves to this business and you didn't resolve it to anywhere, that join might solve part of your problem for your internal data as well. So at this point, I want to back up a little bit and just talk about use cases because, we started with an assumption that you had a business need, that someone came to you and said, hey, we don't have good zip code data, and it's like, so you want to go back and say, well, what do we use zip code data for? What are we doing with this information and how good does it need to be? That's where maybe the U.S. Postal Service's data set is good enough. Maybe you want to get one of these enhanced providers that can bring in data that is truly mappable and usable in an environment like an app. Because if you're sending out trucks to go deliver things, you really need that address data to be very solid. So, and a lot of that's going to come from a combination of multiple external data sources. But that's where the use case is something you really want to go back to the provider and dig in further. How critical is this? How accurate is this? Because it may not just be the acquisition of a source. Maybe you actually partner with an external source to enhance their data set for your use. Maybe they create a new commercial service through it, and but you were the first person that actually came to them and said, "We think you can do this with our help." And there's a lot of opportunity you have in working with your providers with these companies because they don't know how people use their data, and they definitely don't know how your organization wants or needs to use their data. This is going to help drive generative artificial intelligence, engines, and that's a new use case There's something that used to be called text and data mining, which is a predecessor to this activity. And sometimes you have to license your content or that data provider to expose it to those as well. And if you're going to be wanting to use it for that, you want to make sure that you know how they charge for that, if that's okay, and how you can use it. So, providing your audience with tools that they can use, connectors to the data sources to support their work, understanding where they work and what they do. If you've got a group that works in Tableau dashboards, you've got to make sure that this data source is something you can expose to Tableau. If they're utilizing a data lake, you've got to make sure that the connectors are there so that they can find and utilize it, and also that the security permissions are there so that you can authorize their use. If there are restrictions as to what they can combine it with and things like that. Train users to always document their methodologies, and their work can be replicated, validated, and debated in the future. If you create a join, document that join. If you identify a gap in the data and you're going to fill it yourself, capture that work and how it was done so that people can come in later and say, okay, so that worked for the moment, but that's what we need to validate or review on a regular basis. So that you have thought about, and the use case really takes that expenditure of one time or of that data relationship and demonstrates that it's actually a lot more work over time to maintain it. And just as long as everyone's aware that that's what the case is. Which brings me actually to the assessment activity. They've come to you with a critical need, and they said, we need this tomorrow. And you've said, okay, there's a data provider, we can license with them, we'll get it for you, we'll get it into our environment. And then over time, they said, yeah, that was fine for then, but now we need to do this with it, or we need it to be provided in this way. And your relationship evolves. But the other thing is going back to make sure that the people that asked for it are still in the organization. They're still working on that project. Because if you bought something and you put it in your environment and then they got called off into something else, maybe you need to cancel that relationship, you need to stop that. Sometimes, backing out of a data relationship means proving to them that you've removed their data from your environment, being able to pull down a data set and eliminate it, because all you were doing was licensing it and you're not going to continue to maintain it. But knowing who that will affect, whether or not that other people begin to build things against that, is extremely critical in order to make that decision. So, but assessment is a positive activity with your client to say, are we meeting your needs? Is this an ongoing activity that is still valuable? And also, is it worth what we're paying for it? Because sometimes these relationships can go up 5, 10, or 15% cost a year. So over 3 or 4 years, you're now paying almost double what you were paying originally. And they can say, oh, wait a minute, that's, we're not doing that much with this anymore. It's like, so you go back to the market, you see what things are actually costing today. You may have a different provider that can charge a different rate. So without assessment, you can find yourself maintaining data that's no longer needed, or worse yet, find users unaware that the data that you have can address their needs. It's available and they didn't know they had it. It is so sad when you go out and you try and assess a need and you're like, well, we have that over here, but you didn't ask for it that way, or we didn't know that you were also doing work in this area. So, even in that worst case scenario, you have an opportunity to meet someone's needs, to integrate these data resources to make better decisions, which is the end of the day, what you really want to be doing in your organization, whether the data comes internally or from an external provider. So, I have reached the end of my slides in almost a half an hour. So we have a chance to have a conversation here, I hope. I hope you have some questions. I hope this spurred some thought from you, because I know a lot of times when we talk about data, we don't necessarily talk about its origin, where it came from, or how it drives business decisions. So, any questions?
Yeah. I'll open it up to see if there's any questions. Here, I have a mic for you, too, so everybody can hear you. There we go.
So how many data use cases have you done or have worked with, and what was hard and what was easy?
It's hard. There's not a lot that's really easy, to be honest. But so today in my current environment, we do business with about 35 different external data providers. So and we spend probably north of $10 million a year on data alone. So And some of that comes from providers that you have heard of, like Moody's, S&P, Fitch, Bloomberg, and some of them may come from places you wouldn't even have thought. We have a great relationship with mailinglist.com. They produce data, from Dun & Bradstreet's. They pull it together for specific analysis purposes, and so we buy it from them. We have a direct relationship with Dun & Bradstreet's for their in-depth business analysis, but for the data consumption, we're able to acquire it through a reseller. So some of it is what do you need, and then where is it provided, and what's the best use case for us is bringing data in, making it available to the folks that need it. But we acquire large data sets on commercial real estate, on residential mortgage data. We acquire data on where commercial real estate is and what the loans are against it and who's leveraged in those areas. So it's a lot of different data sources that we acquire.
Like a regular process?
It's a rolling process, absolutely, and it's mainly when those relationships come up for renewal. We typically will do a 3 to 5 year agreement, but we'll evaluate throughout that process. At the end of that 3 to 5 year term, that's when we survey the users, make sure that they have what they need, or that we need to go out and get additional material to meet their needs. So it's a rolling process though throughout the year instead of a one-time thing. So because we couldn't do all of those at one time anyways.
Just to follow on, that was one of my questions actually, is did you start out with a predefined budget, or, how do you get that going? Because it sounds like in a lot of companies, they're going to have a case-by-case budget that they have to justify.
So let me tell you, I've seen it done several ways, and I personally think the best way to do it is to make sure that your users have skin in the game. So sometimes they come to you and say, I need this data source to do this work, and I have money, how much is it going to cost? And we go through the process of identifying market research and providing them with that information, and then we'll enter into the agreement and they'll bring the money. Now, the better way to do it also is to bring together a consortium of users of that data set and then apportion the costs across them so that everyone has skin in the game that's going to utilize the data set. So the challenge with them is this worth 20% or 50%? How much of a stakeholder are you in this? And oftentimes those are, what is your anticipated need? So you're paying 50% this year because you anticipate needing it that badly. But next year you may say, we're not using it that much, we want to go down to 20, and then you've got to find the right consortium to reach 100%. So in my case, my organization pays the entire amount, and the business need simply has to come with the requirement. We then have to build a consortium of users, but not of buyers. We are the single payer buyer for our organization. So we work with our chief data officer to make sure that our data stewards are aware of what's commercial available and where it's coming from and who's using it. And sometimes we have to restrict and say this is only bought for this group because of how much it costs and how they priced it. So therefore, if you need it, we need to plan to expand that coverage. So, but single payer, don't set a budget before you get, I actually get to adjust my budget at mid-year, which most businesses can do, not most governments. And I can actually then anticipate for next year and work with people to say, but my procurement timeline is probably 6 to 8 months from when we identify a need to when we can deliver it. And there are times when we can meet an immediate need, on an as-needed basis until we can get it under contract. So those are all factors into that decision-making process. But I think you need to make sure management understands you can't control this by budget.
Right.
So, now what you can do is you can throttle data needs, and you can say we aren't providing this data, and therefore we don't have the information to make that decision. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that can say, oh, well, we need that. How can we remove barriers to get that in-house quickly?
Yeah, another similar kind of related one that I've seen in industries like pharma, for example, is they come in with a budget, but they also anticipate leveraging bartering. Between different other groups where they're trading data, for example. So have you seen that one too?
So not in government. We don't barter all that well. But I can tell you what we do is we communicate with each other about who's using which services. Mm-hmm. We also communicate with the industry about, I like to be a little bit more transparent about who I'm getting data from and what relationships I already have. And I love to do multi-vendor awards where we buy similar sources or similar information at one time from multiple vendors. So if we're going to go out and get this kind of data source, we're going to get it from a few different places so that we can take a look at it. We can see, which, and sometimes we'll increase one and keep the other, or we'll drop one and keep the other. Depends upon what our needs are and how well they're being met. But we don't really get to trade data. I'm sure there are people that would love to have internal FDIC data. We do make a lot of data available publicly, but we can't use it as a leveraging point. Okay. So yeah. Well, that's a really hard question to answer. I mean, what we try and do with that assessment is make sure that it's still delivering value. I think we have the consumer, the user of this information has to say whether or not the value equals what it's costing. But a lot of times we will make sure they are aware this is how much it's costing to meet your need. And if they can say, and there had to be a partner with us to meet their need in some other way. But if you're making an informed decision using this data, and you're like, what, I wouldn't, if I could have made the same decision without that data, then that would be fine. There are times, where, like, I'll use a more of an obtuse example. We have several accounting data sources as far as what is the rule, what is the policy, both international, state, federal accounting. How often are we doing international accounting work? Not a whole lot. We don't need every source for that, but we probably need to be able to have access to one, or maybe have a small group have access to it. So you don't need international accounting information, but if you came to me and said, where can I get a ruling on this decision, I could send you to the attorney that has access to the right resources. And so instead of buying it for everybody, we bought it for a power user or a trained user. So that's how we can make sure the return on investment is there, because if I bought 50 of these and only one person ever used it, that's a lot of money for 50 licenses. If I buy 5 and that team uses it to support everybody, that's a better return on investment. So sometimes, I have an article, if you're interested in looking me up, that says beyond cost per use, because you can't just look at the cost per use. You have to look at the potential of not having it when you need it, at leveraging who knows enough to use it well, to go beyond just a basic calculation of how much was this versus how much we used it. So, but start there, just work from there to make sure you made the right decision.
Yeah. Any more? No, go ahead. I've got more. So.
Yeah. They can range, So in my organization, they can range everywhere from an executive who has this data pumped into a dashboard, so they don't even know where it's coming from, but it's informing their decisions. It's being driven from their data engineers, delivering this to them, to data scientists that have their own analytics dashboards that are working with this data on a regular basis, that are pulling it in and manipulating it as they need to produce reports or research activities, et cetera. It can also be a broad consumer use. I mean, potentially, if it's data that's easily accessible to anybody to get to see what's happening. I buy a huge amount of news information, from a variety of different providers, and it's piped into different users at different times in different ways. We have the American Banker for FDIC that is open to all users via an IP authentication. So you don't even have to authenticate. If you're in our network, you get to theamericanbanker.com and you can read the article. Now, I'd love to know how many articles are read so we know how much that cost versus that value is. That's, you might not say that's data because it's not going into a data system. It's not, but the fact is that article is important for people to make decisions from. Same with New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, all these different news sources. And we can buy them as data and bring them into data systems, or we can buy them as services that we can access either via password, directed access, single sign-on. We have a variety of different ways that we access these resources.
So one of my other questions then, have you run into situations where the users are saying, hey, this data set we purchased is incomplete or
Absolutely,
inaccurate,
yes.
And what do you do and how do you go back?
So what we do is we engage the provider, on their data validation and data accuracy corrections process. Depending upon the provider, they're very willing to engage with us because they want to make their product better. Now getting down to where the errors are or why they exist is a challenge for most providers. But to identify, something very specialized that we are using for very, very important analytical work around what's happening in the financial markets, they want us to trust them. But they also understand that trust comes with validation review, and almost every one of our data providers have a process and a path for us to bring that up. Now, whether it's a single data point and saying, why was this wrong, can you correct it, to looking at, as I said, looking for the null values and saying, how much of this data set is incomplete? And why is that? Is it worth what we're paying for if we're not getting the full thing? So, and to be honest, if we can help them improve that, if we have information to fill in some of those gaps, that's where we are a partner. And we want to help improve their performance as well.
Clean it up a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah.
I have one more, unless anybody
We got
else
one over
has
here.
Oh, great, go ahead.
Yeah. You mentioned like documenting your joins.
Yeah.
And like when you said that, at the same time in my head I'm thinking, oh, that sounds like a good idea. And I'm also thinking that sounds unsustainable. So it's kind of like, what does that look like, and how do you make that happen? And how do you use that?
So we have several different methods for documentation of our data ecosystem. We use something called TFS, which documents decision making. We have a change control board processes that document. If you're talking about every little thing you do, what you hope you have is logging in the system that knows who changed that, why, but maybe not. You don't need a treatise on why you changed it. You need a capture of what's happened. If we go in and we do a join, and we find that the match is good, then capturing, saying that we made that decision because this was what we saw. It doesn't take a lot of documentation to capture that. It's like, but when someone comes along and says, how did you get an address for that business? You want to be able to say, oh, we used an external provider. We had an 80% match, and we utilized that. And then we took the other 20%, and we actually went and did the research to determine who that was. So, but not every one of those actions has to be documented in depth. It just has to be captured. The question is reproducibility. Can someone bring in the data set and get to the same point or a similar point? Things change all the time. But how you've brought it in and what you've done with it, it doesn't have to be a long, detailed description as much as just a capture of the activities that you took. So, if it's not going to be a critical decision point, maybe it's not something you've got to document in depth. But the other thing is that what you don't want to do is have something work and not know how you got there. So that you can't even recreate it. And sometimes you keep flipping switches and it finally works. You're like, well, now document that configuration, not necessarily what you tried, but what worked. So, yeah.
My last question then is going to be just on your slide about transfers versus APIs.
Yeah.
So, is it set up, so I know it's going to be optimal, but is the transfers going to be like kind of that daily or monthly, here's the full data set, or just changes?
So that's a decision you want to make every time you bring a new data set in, and you want to talk with your business user as to what's critical, how sensitive are you to that question. I personally like changes only, so once you've brought the full data set in, so you're not dropping a huge, massive thing to be processed, And I also like us to have a planned schedule, whether it's monthly, quarterly, annually, even for some data sources. They don't have to be refreshed that frequently. So, but that's another thing you want to document and capture, and also understand what the impacts of that are on your decision making. I was talking with someone the other day about, we closed a few banks recently. I don't know if you've heard about it, but our bank find system doesn't say today that those banks are closed, because our bank find system has to have a documented action from within a system that shows the loss ratio of that activity, and we haven't determined that yet for some of these. So they're like, if the public queried those banks in our bank find system, they would see them as still operating. So, and I was like, well, we did create, bank holding companies to take. Shouldn't it have shown the transfer? So, but yeah. So I mean, you want your system to be trustworthy. So, but that may mean some latency. So your sensitivity to latency is what you really want to get the users to express.
On the other side, is it more of a pay per API call, or do you pre-buy it in bucket? Or?
Every business has a different threshold as to when it's more advantageous to do one versus the other. What I want to be able to do is have some sense of how much we're going to be pulling in and where that falls within their price structure. So I am not too sensitive to the pay per. But the other thing is once you have activity, you can go back and say, what would be a right fit for this level of activity? So we have several providers that say you pay a minimum of $3,000 a month, and then if you use it for more than that, we charge you the difference. So you've got a lock-in, but then if we're using $30,000 a month, they don't lock us in at $30,000. That's the nice part. But we have to be able to pay those differentials at that point. So if you're sensitive on that and want to just pay, now the problem is it may be $50,000 a month for an unlimited, and that may be excessive for what you think you're going to use. So, but yeah, they will have pricing structures, and they will probably negotiate with you based on what you think your anticipated use is too. So. I thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it. I hope you get something out of this and the rest of the conference as well.